Ooh, spooky, eh? Want to know how I did it? Stay tuned. Turning yourself into a ghost in a photo is not just a digital magic trick. This trick has been used since the days of film, long ago. The only difference is with digital, we have to do it differently, that's all. And in this video, I'm going to show you how you can do this, okay? Now there are two techniques that you can use, and I'm going to show you both. So the first technique is actually quite simply that old trick of doing a double exposure. Now in the days of film, what we did actually was to take two exposures onto one frame. And the way we did that is we took one photo and then we disconnected the roll of film, we wound it on so the film didn't move and it was in the same place. And then we took another exposure on top of the previous exposure. And by doing that, simply one exposure has the person in, the second exposure has no person in. And then the result is that the person is opaque, just like a ghost. Okay? Because simply what it does, the first exposure captures the person, second exposure captures the background. And then when the two are blended together on one exposure on a piece of film, then the person becomes opaque. And we can do the same thing with digital. The only difference is we have to take two separate exposures and blend them with software. We have to blend them digitally. Now the double exposure trick. There are two ways to do that. The easy way and the slightly more difficult way. And if you have a Canon camera or a Nikon camera, or probably most other cameras too have this same feature, there is a feature inside your camera called multiple exposure mode. And you can use this mode to create your blended double exposure. Okay? I'm shooting with a Canon, so I'm going to show you how to do it on the Canon camera. Okay, now the difficult part is actually getting yourself in the right position. If you're shooting, if you're doing this solely by yourself like I am, it's very useful if you can have someone to help you. Then they can maybe be telling you where to stand in the frame for the best effect. But if you're doing it on your own like I am, then that means basically playing around, trying different shots, lots of test shots, until you find the position that is right for you. And what you need, ideally, okay, it's good to have a hood, that ghostly effect, and you need to be wearing ideally something dark or something white. And what you need to do is contrast with your background just enough to make yourself opaque. If there's too high a contrast, like for example if my head is against the sky, like I show you in a test shot I took just a minute ago, when the head is against the sky is much brighter, and then basically your head is completely gone. But you'll see that the body against it's the slightly lighter background of the green grass, but it's not quite so bright that there's such a huge difference. So what I needed to do in this shot, because I've got a lot of sky, is to get myself just in the right position here where what's behind me is all green grass and green bushes. And at the same time, of course, I want to be in the right position where it looks good. And ideally, what I was trying to do in this shot was to get myself walking down the path. So it looked like there was a ghost walking down the path. So, as I said, I tried lots of different test shots until I finally found the right position. Okay, now, first of all, to do this, you ideally want to use the camera in full manual mode and also manual focus. Okay, so you need to set your focus point first and then switch it to manual so it doesn't move. And you need to set your exposure and everything, and set that to manual so it doesn't move, because the two exposures ideally want to be equal. Okay, so in your menu here, scroll through until you find this multiple exposure. Okay, press to select, and here are your options. Yeah, you have multiple exposure mode. This disables or enables it. On function control means that you can review each image as you shoot it. On continuous shooting, you can't review, and it will take all of the shots before it shows you the final image. Okay. Next one here is multiple exposure control. You have three options here. Okay. Now, I tend to use averaging. Averaging here, average, gives you a good average between the two exposures. And what it does, actually by default, is it takes the first exposure and then it takes a negative compensation on the next exposure. So it will slightly underexpose to control the brightness of the background. So this is the best option to select. You can select bright, which it compares the brights and the darks. But this I found definitely is the best option, average. Here, number of exposures. You can go anywhere between 2 to 9 exposures, so you can do all sorts of effects. But for what we want to do here, we just want 2, because we want to do a simple double exposure. Okay, save source images here just gives you the choice to save the result only and all images. Okay, I save just the result only. And then this basically means that if you select this option one shot only, it will do one multiple exposure and then it will automatically disable this feature. So you don't go on shooting continuously double exposures or multiple exposures like I have sometimes. I've done my double exposure and then gone off to do something normal, and I've forgot that I still had the multiple exposure mode set. So you can set it to just do one and then it disables. Or if you set it continuously, it will stay in the multiple exposure mode until you disable it yourself. Okay, so I select that to one shot only. Okay, now one thing I will say, when you here we are, when you do this, always set your image to shoot, your camera to shoot in RAW. Okay, because it can happen sometimes that you get some problems. You know, maybe your sky is a touch too bright and you want to pull back some of the highlights or darken some areas. You know, you can do some work in post-processing to really bring it out, because what we're doing here is we're letting the camera do everything and it will automatically do it. And you know, it does a fairly good job, but sometimes it could use a few extra tweaks. Plus, also, sometimes with the multiple exposure mode, depending on the scene that you're shooting, you can get some color irregularities. So you want to do some color correction in post-processing. And if you've saved a JPEG, then the last thing you want to do is mess around with it. Okay, so shoot in RAW and it will save the multiple exposure or the double exposure into one RAW file that you can work with. Okay, so let's go back. multiple exposure mode. I'm going to use on control function so I can control. Okay, now I've already set my scene here. Now I've set my exposure, so I've made it fairly dark in the foreground. The sky is very bright, so I want some detail there in the sky. Now I could put a grad on there and do all sorts of other things, but I'm not going to mess around with that right now. I'm just going to demonstrate this for you. Okay, so oh, there we go. That's set. Now I'll show you the next step. Okay, so the light has changed, so I'm going to adjust my exposure a bit. But I've got my focus set and I'm ready to go. Now, because you're doing this yourself and you need to run out and get in position, I use a 10-second timer for my shot. Okay, so I'm going to take the first shot and run into position, and then I'm going to come back and take the second shot without me in it, and I'll show you the result. Now I'll take the shot without me in it. There you go, I'll show you now. Okay, so now I'm going to do this manually. I'm going to take 2 exposures myself and then I'm going to blend them in Photoshop. Okay, so I'll show you the process. Now the first photo I take will be a little bit brighter, more exposed for the foreground. And then when I take my second photo without me, I'm going to underexpose it a bit to keep the detail of the sky in. Okay, that way I keep my background quite bright, so you can see it through me. It's not too dark, but at the same time I don't blow out the sky. Okay, so here we go. Okay, I'll show you the 2 individual photos and then I'll show you how to blend them in Photoshop. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how to process and blend these 2 photos using Adobe Photoshop. You can also use Lightroom and probably any other photo editing software that you use. But for this demonstration I'm going to show you in Photoshop. Now the first thing you need to do is open your 2 photos and put them into 2 layers in one photo. Now there are 2 ways to do this. The easiest way is to go File, Scripts, Load Files into Stack. Now I've already processed and opened the two photos from RAW and saved them as uncompressed TIFFs. So here, we use Files. I'm going to go to Browse. This is my folder where my two pictures are, and these are the two pictures I want to work with. So we can select both. Hold down the Control key to select the two. Click OK. There are your two files here. Then make sure neither of these are checked. This first button, attempt to automatically align source images. Now you only want to use that if you think your two images are out of line. You know, if there was some movement between the two photos, and I mean camera movement, and you think that the images may not line up perfectly, you can use this to let the Photoshop automatically try and do it, or just leave it unchecked. Okay, and for this we don't want to create a smart object, so we just leave that unchecked, and we want to open them into two separate layers like this. Okay, now you can see down here, if you've got the layers palette open down here, you can find that in Windows, and if you come down here, make sure layers is ticked, and you'll find it down here in your palette somewhere. And you should have then two layers. Yeah, you've got the two layered here together. The other way to do it, if we just close that, is to simply open the two, select them both, open the two. Okay, now you've got two separate files here, and then what you want to do for this case, usually I like to paste the layer without me on top of the layer with me. Okay, it doesn't matter which way you do it, but so in this case I'm going to go to select all, so we select the whole photo. Okay, I'm going to go to edit, copy, then select my other file here, go to edit and paste. Now then you're basically pasting another layer on top of this, so you've got your two layers. There's two ways to do it. Either way it doesn't really matter, as long as you get two separate layers here that you can work with. Okay, now my images are perfectly lined up, so there are several ways you can do this. The simplest way is if you go down here, you can select the individual layers. So if you select the top layer and go to opacity, and just simply, as you pull down your opacity, you'll see the image below starting to appear, and I'm starting to appear as a ghost already. Okay, so how, you know, the more you adjust down your opacity, the clearer the layer below becomes. So you can see that already. If we go right through, then I'm completely there. Okay, so for the ghost effect, you can see like 70% seems to work quite nicely. Maybe you want to take it to 65. Okay, now that's very simple. Now zoom in and check everywhere else in the image to make sure that everything's lined up, that you haven't got any ghosting. Okay, in the clouds, in the buildings at the back, anything like that. You can see that everything is perfect, everything is nice and clear. Okay, that's when it's that simple. It's that simple, but sometimes maybe it's not. You know, sometimes there are this opacity will blend through everything, so that can be okay in that case. But maybe you don't want, you know, to paste through the sky. See, you can see here, for example, that it's lightened the sky a touch too. So there is another way that you can do it, and the other way is then to select this top layer, go up here to layer, layer mask, reveal all. This now creates then a layer mask on the top. Now there are two tools you can use here. The first one is this gradient tool. Okay, and again we can adjust the opacity. For the gradient tool, it's the opposite. You want a smaller percentage. And now what I can do is I can go up here, and if I pull up this tool here, there you go. Now what I've done here is blended through the lower half of the image, but not the top half. Okay, so you can see if I undo that, it hasn't made any difference to the sky, but it has blended through the bottom half and created the same effect. Okay, let's undo that. For a slightly more controlled, more accurate effect, you can go, sorry, not this one, to the brush tool here. Okay, brush tool works in the same way. Select your opacity, and here you select your brush size. Okay, now if I want to brush through all of this big area here, I want a really, really big brush size. Otherwise, okay, that's super small. So you can adjust your brush size accordingly. The hardness basically is the edge of the brush. Okay, so if we make it 0, it's a nice soft brush. If we make it 100%, it's a really hard brush. Can you see that? Yeah. If we make it 0, it's a softer brush effect. So we really want a soft brush effect on this, because otherwise you see all the hard edges and it looks unnatural. So I'm going to make a really big brush here, because I'm going to brush through a really large area. Now, here. Now I'm brushing through this area here at the opacity that I've set. Okay, if I undo that, if I want to increase my opacity here, because we're doing the opposite here. We're actually revealing the layer underneath. So in this case, then at 70%, you would see more of me, whereas the first way I showed you, it's the opposite. 70% reveals less of me. Okay, so you can always easily undo it and find the level of opacity that you want. It all depends on how opaque you want your subject to be. Okay, undo that. I find, yeah, like 40%, as I showed you, is the best way. Yeah, so we can really control. We have a finer control here with this tool. So it depends on your image and what's in your image, what's around the subject, and really how much you want to blend through in your image. In this particular image, as we saw, if I just remove the layer mask, it was quite enough really to do that. Okay, now I want to also show you here what can happen when you have something else moving in your scene. Now remember, we've taken 2 photos, and although you want to remove yourself from the scene, if something else in the scene is moving, then you can have problems when you blend the 2. That's where you can get ghosting. Now I showed you that you have to set it up on the tripod, you set everything to full manual, you use a shutter release cable so you don't touch the camera, you don't move anything, and so each picture is identical. But we can't stop clouds moving, and so, you know, sometimes depends on the image itself, but if you've got clouds that kind of moved a little bit and you blend them through, then you can get ghosting effect on the sky, for example. So I can, now that was one of the reasons in my first image here, yeah, it was very bright. I exposed it so the sky was actually burned out, there wasn't much detail. But then in my second image I underexposed it a bit and I captured some more detail. Okay, so then the image that I used on top was darker, which meant that I had some detail in the sky. But when I blended through the image below, because there was no detail in the sky in that image, I didn't get any ghosting effect. But let's say, for argument's sake, that I had underexposed that first image. So I'm going to go to the raw file now, 267. Okay, now let's move that down a bit so you can see. There we go. Now in this image I've actually applied a gradient deliberately so I can pull back the detail in the sky in this image. Okay, now I'm going to open this image. Okay, and now I'm going to blend this one. Copy, paste. Okay, now I'm going to layer this darker one onto that one below, and now if we blend this through, okay, take that to 60%. Now can you see I've got this double effect on the sky here, and it doesn't look too good. Okay, it's not too bad, but it doesn't, you know, it look that great, whereas the image before looked a lot better. If I blend that one through, that's the one I did before, we haven't got any of that. See the difference? Here you've got kind of a double cloud effect. Here you haven't. Okay, so that's something to watch out for when you're blending. And I could show you really an example of what would happen if there was some kind of movement between the two images. If your two images were not perfectly aligned, this is what would happen. So I can simulate that by selecting this layer, for example, and selecting my move tool, and if I move this, start to move it a little bit, can you see this ghosting effect? That's what happens. If I'm moving now, that's what happens if your images are not perfectly lined up. This is the effect that you would get. Now, as I said, you can use that auto align, or it might be possible that you could simply line it up yourself by clicking the move tool and using the cursors on your keyboard, because this gives you a much finer control. So let's imagine my two images were not quite perfectly lined up. I could just tweak. Oh, there we go. Yeah, I can manually line them up myself, and then I would have to go probably to the edges here and just crop it a bit to overcome that. So that's possible that you can do that, but ideally you want to avoid that completely when taking your photo. Well, there you go. How to make yourself into a ghost in your photos. It's quite easy really when you know how, like most things. So give it a go yourself, and thanks for watching. Hope you've enjoyed this, hope you found it useful, and if you did, please like and subscribe and check out some of my other videos, and catch you later.